Because before that there were a lot of studies on the city. This is very important. These studies probably exist also here, and if you want to structure an inventory, you have to be aware of these studies and try to find from these studies the elements which are important, which deserve to be recorded and which deserve to be documented. Let's start with the cases. The case of Assisi, a small town in central Italy. There was probably the first detailed and systematic plan for an historic center that was made in 55-57, where the so-called inventory, it was not a named inventory, which was based on an extremely detailed survey, house by house, which was focused both on the architectural value of the buildings and on the socio-economic condition of the families which were living in the houses. There were no GIS at the time, everything was made by hand, but anyway, the plan was based on the cross between these two types of information. Information about the physical conditions and the architectural values of the building, and on the state of conservation, of course, of the building as well, and on the economic conditions of the families. The idea was that it was important to know which were the buildings and which were the parts of the city that could be upgraded or rehabilitated, and which needed some kind of subsidies and some kind of help, For the rest, the plan of the historic center not only defined the types of interventions for each building, but also in some streets provided prescriptions and recommendations about concerning the type of construction or the type of work that should be done. Let's go ahead. Here is the case of Siena. Well, it's worthless to say that the plan has perfectly preserved the city. It has avoided, that the new expansions merge with the historic fabric, because the new expansions were designed, planned separately from the historic center, and so on. And Assisi nowadays is a very important, not only tourist attraction, but also a very important religious place, because, it's the headquarters of the Franciscan. Probably even in Romania you have the Franciscan friars and so on. They are based in Assisi, and they have been amongst the protagonists, of the rehabilitation of the city and about its conservation. Let's take another example, Siena. Here I go very fast because I don't have, in Siena there was no systematic survey house by house, household by household. There was an overall strategy, which nevertheless it has been extremely successful. It would be worth to discuss it. But it's interesting to note that the historic city of Siena has been very well preserved, even without inventory, because there was an urban strategy that achieved the same effect, of protection that is usually achieved through building by building control. This is also interesting. It depends very much on the strategy which was set up in the 50s and 60s by the master plan. In particular, the master plan preserved all the green areas within the walls and provided for a new expansion outside the walls with no contact with the historic city. And another important issue, even if it doesn't has nothing to do with the inventory, but it's very important, and you have to reflect on that as a planner. The medieval pattern of Siena is totally unfit to vehicular traffic. And this plan did not provide any new cut, any new opening. It simply provided a very limited opening for ambulances, services, and so on. The plan at the end of the 50s and the 60s thought that the city should remain pedestrian. And in 67, Siena was the first city that was fully pedestrianized, completely pedestrianized. In spite of this, Siena is nowadays one of the most, not only one of the most preserved cities, but is also a city which is very lively, which attracts a lot of tourists, a lot of students, and which also keeps the functions that he has always had. That is, a very important banking center, because it remains the headquarters of one of the most important banks in Italy. Italy is also, I could say, a business center, because there are important industries in the surrounding territories which have their headquarters there. So this is just to say that even without car, a city can be modern, can accommodate important and prestigious functions, you know, because of the quality of the environment. This has nothing to do perhaps with the inventory, but this leads to the fact that in order to the quality of the urban environment is a priority, and each one, even without the need of a very strict control, knows that the enhancement and the conservation of the historic features is very important, even to valorize its own property. You see? Another case, Urbino. Urbino, it's a city which was really decaying in the 60s, but it is one of the capital cities of the Italian Renaissance, with a very important ducal palace, with a very important museum. It's the city where Piero della Francesca, Bramante, and others, you know, were operating. So it's a very important art center, but it was totally decayed. So the master plan, again, like in the case of Siena and Assisi, tried to reinforce the role of Urbino, and found as a possible function to reinforce the role of Urbino, of the city center, of the historic city, the university. On the other hand, the plan understood that probably one of the most important qualities of Urbino was the landscape surrounding the city, and the landscape and the urban landscape within the city. So the plan was based on a very detailed and accurate analysis of all the landscape features that deserve to be protected, all the visual relationship that has to be preserved, and the same within the historic fabric. A visual analysis was carried out in order to identify the landmarks, to identify the visual channels, the pathways. This is extremely important to keep to preserve a very high urban quality. And the master plan for the whole territory, as well as the measures of protection for the historic city, were strongly based on this visual analysis. For instance, the master plan, the zone of development, the development areas, or the areas to be, strengthened, you know, were identified based on the visual analysis of the territory, and the new expansion areas were located and shaped in such a way that do not hamper the visual relationship or the visual channels between the historic city and the most important landscape in the surrounding territory. Of course, the historic city, here we go back to the inventory, was preserved based on a very detailed inventory, like in the case of Assisi. building by building, which mostly focused on the architectural quality and which provided very clear and strict classification of the building according to the different types of interventions which were admitted. That is from restoration, as I said before, rehabilitation, renewal, demolition and rebuilding, or simply demolition. A little bit like the case of Bayonne, of the secteur Sauvegarde, which I showed you yesterday. But this was made 40 years before. Equally, the plan for the historic city gave a prescription concerning the materials to be adopted in the repaving of the streets and in the refurbishment of the roof. Urbino is a hilly city, so you can see the buildings not only from below but also from above. So it is extremely important to control the materials, the roofs, and the streets. You know, when you walk in the streets uphill, the paving of the street is like a facade, and it has to be carefully planned, you know, and it has to be, the plan considers that the paving, the street paving, is indeed, it has the same value, environmental value, of the facades of the buildings. And indeed, these measures has made possible to keep and even to enhance a total coherence, you know, of the urban space, from ground to the elevation of the buildings. So again, you can see this has very little to do with inventory, but it is equally important when you have to set up a policy for conservation and preservation of the city. And these are aspects that have to be taken into consideration when you prepare your building regulations or your planning prescriptions. I don't want to talk about the projects that were included in the master plan in order to increase the presence of the university in the city and in order to reuse. Yesterday we were talking about adaptive reuse. This is a plan which is heavily based on adaptive reuse. A lot of abandoned buildings or a lot of obsolete buildings were identified in order to be reused, public and private, were identified in order to be reused for new university facilities or for activities which are related to the presence of the students. So guest houses and libraries and so on. In particular, you can see that all these convents were identified as possible accommodation of the new faculties that the University of Urbino was going to open. All of these are set in the historic center. All these are set in different types of complexes where interventions of reuse have been carried out using, preserving, let's say, restoring where is possible, restoring the valuable parts of the buildings, but sometimes also partially renovating the building, for instance, replacing decayed part of the buildings or even modern part of the buildings with contemporary architecture in order to provide new functions. For instance, it is interesting to see, you see, this is a huge conference hall. At the time in the 70s, it was, end of the 70s, it was the largest conference hall in Urbino, which is there, you know, which is there. So it's a huge conference hall for 800 people that can be subdivided in smaller conference or seminar rooms with a system of moving walls, well, it doesn't matter. But this is just to say that adaptive reuse allows also for intervention of a high level of technology, you know, in order to introduce in the historic city new types of activities which are able to attract people. I simply tell you that Urbino, it used to be a very decayed city in the 60s. Now it's a quite, I would say, a very attractive city, not only for university, but also for a lot of cultural activities, conferences, congresses, the so-called cultural tourism or whatever. The city has been largely restored or rehabilitated and so on. And the value of the building, to go back to one of the issues that were raised yesterday, has become so high that most of the inhabitants, which are also owners, because in Italy 80% of the families are owners of the house where they live, they prefer to sell, you know, or to rent to the students, for instance, their apartment, and build new villas, you know, in the countryside. As a matter of fact, now Urbino, due to the success of conservation, has lost part of its social content, you know, because the inhabitants are living in the outskirts and rent the houses to the students or to the tourists or to the scholars that goes to Urbino to make service. So conservation needs money, and this is a very heavy contradiction that has to be taken into account, you know, nowadays, today. But as a matter of fact, you know, what is important is that adaptive reuse always allows for improving urban environment, and provides also a tool for a modernization which may respect, you know, the values of the past. It's also interesting to see that this is a very famous building. These are the students' houses, the first students' houses that were built in the 60s, and these are the new development of the student housing. I don't know if some of you know a book of Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. It's a novel book, but it's one of the best books of urban planning I know. Many stories of this book have these colleges as a location. This is the extension of the colleges. What I would like to show you here is that the old city provided the models, you know, for the new settlements. These settlements are entirely contemporary, but they are structured with the same logic of adaptation to the site that characterizes an historic city. We go closer and closer to the inventory. Bologna, again, Bologna started in the late 60s, you know, to make a very important plan of conservation of the historic city. This plan is probably the most famous plan in Italy, for sure, but even in Europe, and it represented a sort of model, you know, for the establishment of a long-term policy of conservation. The principle was the active preservation. It is a plan that benefits from the experiences I showed before, Siena, Sisi, Urbino, and others, that set the planning, the conservation of the historic center of a major issue of urban planning. The importance of the Bologna, of the plan of Bologna for the historic city is what I said yesterday. This was the first plan that decided to spend the money for social housing. At the time, it was a lot of money, because at the time social housing in Italy represented 10–15% of the total housing production. Now it's less than 1%, so it's almost nothing. I don't know, in Romania. Italy has never had a very strong policy of social housing like other countries, like France perhaps. But nevertheless, at the time, the municipality were given quite a bit of money, for social housing. And usually, social housing interventions were scattered in the periphery, Bologna was the first city that decided to use part of this money in the historic center, not to build new buildings, but to refurbish, upgrade, and rehabilitate the most decayed areas of the historic city. So for this reason, a number of areas were identified, where this money should be spent. The inventory. First step for the inventory was, again, to identify the basic building types. A little bit as it happened in Venice. To identify the basic building types and to, for housing, but also the building types of special buildings, like the churches, the convent, and so on. And then, on the basis of these typologies, of these typological studies, were proposed layouts of possible functional reuse. Here you can see, for instance, for these typologies, the possible layout of reuse of the typology. This study was aimed at spending the money in an appropriate way. In other terms, there were rules, general rules, of course, which requires to be adapted to individual buildings, but this rule allowed to know how many rooms could be rehabilitated, how many families could be accommodated, how many, and so on, to make a calculation of the cost, to make a work plan, to make a schedule of the works, because the works were completely paid by the municipality. Of course, the municipality has both already owned the most of the buildings, but in the case of buildings which were used by the private, which were owned by the private, the municipality covered the cost of rehabilitation, provided that the private implement this layout. So, you see, the logic is identify the typologies, see what is the potential of the typology, and then intervene according in order to exploit the potential of the different typologies. So, the inventory was made based on the recognition of these typologies. And the inventory, there were no GIS, but they managed to do it in any case, manually, of course. It takes more time, but it's possible to do it. And in the end, the interventions covered 7 blocks like this, of this type, and for a total of 1,500 dwellings in 5 years, which is not little, which is quite a lot. Here you can see some of the interventions. It is interesting to say that the logic was the reuse, first of all, but in some blocks there were some empty plots or some plots with ruins. We were in the 70s and there were many decayed areas even in the historic center. In this case, you can see that the plan provides for the reconstruction according, or new construction indeed, but according to the typologies that were described before, in order to recreate, let's say, the historic fabric in a very consistent way. Also, the intervention on the existing buildings, you see here, this was the current state, and this is the project which was implemented, provided, for instance, for the demolition of inconsistent vertical additions, for the regularization of the windows and openings, and so on. This is the result. After 30 years it works. It works so well that the inhabitants, many inhabitants in the wild has become owners, of dwellings where they used to live, have sold their dwelling and has gone away, because this is about 8,000 to 10,000 euro square meter. So nowadays. So again, I go back to what I said yesterday. Conservation makes money. It's not a cost, it's an investment. It's a different story. And but the investment has to be considered in a general framework. It has to be considered as in a framework which is the framework of the city and of the overall improvement of the urban environment. But it's clear that the fact that conservation is an investment is also a danger. I would like to underline this very issue. Is a danger because if it is too much successful, it produces in the end, a loss of inhabitation, a loss of inhabitants. They go away. A radical change in the population, and so on.